Glad you're here for Unintended Consequences, episode 43, for June 29th, 2026. Monday, a fresh case to chew on as the week begins. Automakers recast streets as car space and turned crossing them into a crime, reshaping cities for a century. In 1923, Cincinnati police began ticketing adults for stepping off the curb anywhere except at a corner crosswalk. An act that had been ordinary for generations suddenly carried a fine because the city had decided that only the intersection counted as a legal place to enter the roadway. The change followed intensive lobbying by automobile manufacturers and local motor clubs. They argued that pedestrians, not drivers, were the main source of collisions, and they backed that claim with the collision data they had collected from their own clubs. What began as an effort to reduce deaths on crowded streets ended by redefining the street itself as a place where people on foot no longer belonged by right. In other words, the curb became a legal boundary rather than a simple physical edge. In the early 1920s, American cities faced sharply rising pedestrian fatalities. Motor vehicle registrations climbed from roughly 8 million in 1920 to more than 20 million by 1927. That is an increase of more than 12 million vehicles in 7 years, which meant that on many downtown blocks, the number of cars passing any given point had roughly doubled or tripled within the span of a single city council term. City engineers, police officials, and insurance companies viewed unregulated street use as a public health crisis. Children still played in roadways, and adults crossed wherever they chose because nothing in the existing common law tradition had ever told them they could not. The National Conference on Street and Highway Safety, convened in 1924 under Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover, brought together traffic engineers and safety advocates. They believed uniform rules could separate flows of movement and lower the death toll by making each user's location predictable. Automobile trade groups such as the National Automobile Chamber of Commerce joined these meetings. They contributed data on collisions and argued that clear legal priority for vehicles would protect everyone, including the pedestrians who would now know exactly where they were supposed to be. At the time, the proposal seemed technical and neutral. Codify where pedestrians should walk so drivers could anticipate them and the arithmetic of crashes would improve. No one in those rooms imagined the rules would later be used to justify the near-total redesign of urban space around the automobile, because the discussion stayed focused on the single variable of mid-block collisions. Between 1924 and 1930, dozens of cities passed ordinances that criminalized jaywalking. The term was popularized by auto club publicity that labeled mid-block crossing as rural ignorance, a rhetorical move that turned an everyday habit into a social failing. Los Angeles adopted one of the earliest strict statutes in 1925. New York, Chicago, and Detroit followed within a few years, each copying language that had already been tested in court. Model legislation circulated by the American Automobile Association helped spread the language to smaller cities that lacked their own drafting staff. Newspapers ran safety campaigns funded by motor interests that showed cartoon jays darting into traffic and being struck, and those images appeared week after week in the same papers that also carried automobile advertising. School programs taught children to treat streets as dangerous territory reserved for cars, so that an entire generation learned the new boundary as if it had always existed. Early data from cities that enforced the rules showed a measurable drop in mid-block collisions. Proponents cited this as proof the policy worked, and the drop was real on the specific metric they measured. A few planners and downtown merchants warned that the laws would discourage foot traffic and favor suburban growth. Yet their objections were treated as minor compared with the visible reduction in downtown accidents, because the accident count inside city limits was the only number the conference had asked anyone to watch. Once jaywalking statutes were on the books, the legal balance of liability shifted decisively. Courts began treating any pedestrian outside a marked crossing as contributorily negligent, which meant that even a driver traveling well above the posted speed could escape most financial responsibility if the injured person had not been at a corner. This sharply reduced the number of successful lawsuits against drivers and insurers because the pedestrian now carried the heavier burden of proof. With legal risk lowered, cities widened roadways, removed streetcar tracks, and added traffic signals timed for vehicle throughput rather than foot movement. The arithmetic here is straightforward. Once insurers paid out fewer claims per mile of road, municipal engineers could justify spending tax dollars to add lanes and to synchronize lights so that a continuous stream of cars could pass through an intersection without stopping for people waiting to cross. The second order effect was rapid. Retail districts that had relied on easy pedestrian access lost customers to new drive-in shopping centers built at the urban fringe, because the same widened roads that sped cars through downtown also made it practical to locate stores where parking lots could be larger and cheaper. This accelerated the decentralization that later became suburban sprawl. By the 1950s, federal highway funding further embedded the assumption that streets existed primarily for cars. Neighborhoods built before 1920 found themselves bisected by high-speed arterials, where crossing on foot required long detours, sometimes several blocks out of the way. Third-order consequences compounded over decades. Reduced street life lowered informal surveillance, contributing to the sense that downtowns were unsafe after dark, because fewer people were simply walking past storefronts at ordinary hours. Public health researchers later documented that the same infrastructure changes correlated with sharp declines in routine walking, a factor now linked to rising rates of obesity and cardiovascular disease. The original safety goal was never abandoned, yet the system that emerged produced a built environment in which the safest legal choice for most people was to drive even short distances, because the physical layout and the liability rules now reinforced each other. By the 1970s, some transportation planners began questioning whether the 1920s rules had overshot their mark. Experiments with shared space designs in Europe, and later, in a handful of U.S. cities, such as West Palm Beach and New York's Times Square, showed that removing strict separation could slow traffic and improve pedestrian safety without new criminal penalties. Most American municipalities, however, retained the jaywalking statutes. Enforcement simply became sporadic, so the legal rule stayed on the books while daily practice varied by neighborhood and by police department priorities. Recent state-level reforms in places such as Virginia in 2020 and California in 2022 have decriminalized mid-block crossing when it can be done safely. Yet the physical legacy of wide lanes and limited crosswalks remains expensive to undo, because every added lane and every removed streetcar track represented capital spending that cities are still amortizing. The meta-irony is that many current complete streets and Vision Zero programs must now spend public funds to reverse design choices that were themselves sold as safety measures a century earlier. When a powerful interest group frames a safety problem in terms that align with its own technology, the resulting rules can quietly transfer rights and resources for generations. Complex urban systems rarely respond to single variable interventions. Reassigning legal priority on streets altered land use patterns, retail economics, and daily physical activity in ways no 1924 conference table could have modeled, because each change in liability or road width created new incentives that compounded across decades. The durable lesson is to test any proposed reallocation of public space against the question of who will still be able to move freely once the new rules are enforced and the concrete has set. Consider today's debates over dedicated lanes for autonomous delivery robots on city sidewalks. Who gains priority and who loses the ability to linger or cross without penalty? That's unintended consequences for today. If this episode gave you something to think about, share it with a friend who'd appreciate the story. Subscribe wherever you listen, and we'll be back tomorrow with another case. And if you'd rather watch than listen, find us on YouTube at Nara Network. Links in the show notes. And before you go, this show is part of the Nura Network, a family of daily podcasts on tech, science, and markets, each one a short, sharp briefing you can finish on the commute. If today earned its place in your feed, here's your next listen. Environmental Intelligence, the Environment and Climate Policy Brief for Canada. Find every show free at naranetwork.com. This episode used AI voice synthesis of my voice. Editorial selection and analysis are my own.